And welcome. And here we are at the end of 2019. And here I am. I'm still here. I still make videos. I still talk about theories whenever I can, whenever they formulate in my mind, which sometimes can take multiple months, as you can see. I don't have anything very holiday pertinent to talk about right now. I wish I did. I do feel sort of compelled to get into more kind of optimistic, familial, happy holiday themed content around this time, but I just don't have anything right now, I'll be honest. The only thing I have are theories which have been bouncing around my head for a while. So this video is kind of just it's a video for it to be a video. I'm making a video just to make a video because it's been a while since I made a video and I wanted to make something else before we hit 2020. Hopefully 2020 will be a more active year. So, that being said, I want to talk about the incel problem. And this is actually kind of relevant to the holidays because it does pertain to people being lonely during the holidays and stuff like that, and people, the compulsion to encourage people to not be lonely, to be with friends, to be with family, or whatever the heck, to find ways to actualize ourselves socially, which is a good thing. But that's not exactly what I want to talk about. I just want to talk about the incel problem in general. The incel problem is, in my mind, it's a very important one. It's something that, again, like I said, bounces around my head for a while. There's been plenty of times where I've tried to make a video about it and I've dropped it because it didn't feel right. It didn't feel correct. It felt off in some sense, and it's a difficult thing to talk about because of how, well, for multiple reasons. For one, how it comes across to virtually everyone. There's a judgment attached to it, pretty much regardless of what your position is, and that's difficult to navigate. It's hard to separate your own personal interests from the analysis. It's hard to do that part for something like anything related to sexuality, any philosophical problem related to sexuality, and third of all, there's just a controversy attached to it, and I kind of want to avoid the noise of the controversy and not label myself in any kind of crude way, but I will warn people now, I don't have I don't have nice opinions about this topic. I wish I did. I wish this was something that you could easily kind of brush off. I just don't think it is. To explain briefly where I fall on this, you know how we have within politics, there's progressives and conservatives? You know how that dichotomy exists? Now, that dichotomy exists for the market, right? So you have libertarians for the market, and then you have progressives who think the market should be regulated and stuff like that, and wealth inequality is a problematic thing, and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's libertarian folk who are like, no, none of that matters. Just let the market breathe. Just let it do what it wants. So if you just apply that analogy to sexuality, I would then say that, roughly speaking, not exactly, not that there's any specific positions in this, but roughly speaking, I would say that I'm kind of like the progressives for the sexuality market, right? In that I find the contention of being a libertarian with the sexuality market to be problematic anytime anyone expresses it, and for the obvious reason is that it seems to be for the same reason that libertarians for the actual market seems to be problematic. For the same reason is that it's a clever way of reverse justifying your own interests without examining any potential problem. And I've had a lot of arguments about this over the years. One of my favorite arguments with leftists on this is that and this is the thing, is that it seems to be like virtually everyone isn't in that camp. Who is honestly progressive when it comes to the sexual market. in that same way that people are progressive about like the actual physical economy, there's almost no one. I think leftists, for the most part, take this very kind of like hard nurture take, and their idea is that you need to sort of you need to fix the way, you need to have, people need to be more accepting of one another's sexuality, and they need to know and respect boundaries, and they need to, not, understand things like consent and et cetera, et cetera. They need to do all these things, and they need to not be like too pushy, because people don't like that. Don't be too pushy, because then that's where you get sex pests, and sex pests perpetuate some sort of like toxic culture of sexuality. That's their version of it. They explain it all with nurture. I find it all hard to believe. It doesn't seem to fit my own experience. It doesn't seem to fit the experience of most people I talk to, except for leftists. Then they say, well, you chalk it off as pure nurture, but then the question becomes, well, okay, if you're chalking it off as pure nurture, that means that the part of the system that's designed by nature is already optimized. And this is the ultimate like pitfall of every single leftist perspective on everything, is that if the nurture argument, even if the nurture argument is correct, you are still assuming, presuming, in fact, that the nature part of the system is all, like, the part of the system that's relatively fixed is already optimal. And I don't see how you can make that assumption. Or you can make the argument, but I don't see how you can make the assumption. And of course, their way of doing it is because they think that the nature just accounts for very little of what we see, and really that nature is kind of, the way that nature is nature just kind of this open flower, and everything on top of it is this fluid mess that can just be anything. And that's not, that still needs to have rules. That can't just be anything. And that's where my problem with their perspective on this is. I hope they're right. I wish they were. I just don't see that as being true. And I actually do have a problem with it when it comes to like things that are far more material than sexuality. Things that are things like art and aesthetics. That's where I'm like, no. There's no way that this is just like, the truth is just some open field for you to have whatever subjective feeling you want. That's not how this works. So that's the leftist perspective, my understanding of it at least. That's generally where they seem to be. Then there's the traditionalist perspective, which I guess is more conservative, which is essentially that people need to adopt some sort of more traditionalist values when it comes to sexuality. They need to try to be monogamous. They need to, probably try to be more celibate. They need to be reserved. They need to be very careful when picking a mate, and so on and so forth. They need to be restrictive. The problem with that, I guess I'm just getting into it now and talking about it. Yeah, the problem with that is, that's not gonna work. I mean, that's not what's happening now, and that's not what's gonna work going down the road into the future. Like, that could be the kind of ultimate, like, endpoint of all these things, past a certain generational like point, like after you're 40 or 35 or whatever age, that's when that's what it becomes reduced to. But that's not good enough. Like, the idea is that, like, oh, okay, we can settle down and all be monogamous and everything works out once you're north of 30. But what happens before then? What happens in your 20s? What happens during that age range? Or what are we supposed to say? During that age range, no, it's a complete, it's a complete free market, and it's a complete free market shit show where whatever outcome happens, and it doesn't matter what evaluative sort of differences we see between men and women during that time. It's like, and it's so weird to me because, like, I guess with conservatives is different because they simply take comfort in the fact that they take comfort in the fact that ultimately their sort of understanding of the paradigm is what will be reinforced. So it's like, at the end of the day, after all is said and done during your 20s where you're just partying and nothing matters, men and women settle down and they become more mature. Well, I'm not a fan of maturity. And I don't see that. I don't see, like, I don't get comfort out of chasing that particular endpoint. I also just don't think that it's what seems to be happening, like, throughout the world. It doesn't seem to be how people understand sexuality anymore. It seems to, you know, yeah, like, sexual liberation seems to have had far more of an effect, even so far that, like, these simple conservative, like not conservative, but like these older paradigms, they tend to exist for the most part, but they don't exist entirely. And well, yeah, I guess philosophically, even if this conservative paradigm was all that mattered, it still bothers me because I don't see why it should. I don't see why this paradigm's better. And that's what every argument with every conservative when it comes to sexuality sort of feels like, is it's just like, oh, you know, just focus on making money and just focus on sort of gaining resources or whatever, and, you know, you'll find a mate, and then that paradigm will just work. But it's like, who the fuck wants that paradigm? Like, why is that paradigm so appealing? I've never found that paradigm to be appealing. Not particularly. Not for myself. But also for the system. Like, I don't see why it's systemically appealing to have everyone fit that mold. I can understand why most people should. I could even see why a good chunk of people should. But philosophically speaking, why should the system itself just embrace nothing but that? That's where we get into a problem. That's the traditionalist perspective. And then you have sort of the kind of, like, ultra cynical, like, more nihilistic perspective of, like, MGTOWs and stuff, where it's just, you know what, fuck it. The women are terrible. Sexuality's terrible, so just, like, fucking do your own thing. Men should go their own way, or, you know, try to be these kind of, like, ultra Chad alpha male types who, you know, the pickup artist culture and all that, and just have as much fun with it as you can, but, you know, relationships are worthless and relationships are doomed. And that's their perspective, and I don't agree with that, because if relationships are doomed, what the fuck is the point? If relationships are doomed, what is the point of there even being, like, two genders? What is the point of there being, at the bare minimum, two genders? What is the point of there being two sexes? What is the point of this dichotomy existing if relationships are doomed? That doesn't make any sense. Even if, and you could, well, you might say, well, the point is procreation. Well, before we even get into that, before I get to the second half of this video where I explain why that doesn't matter when I put on the table what I'm about to put on the table later on in the video. The fact of the matter is, procreation can't be the only concern here, because there's artificial forms of, there can be artificial ways of procreating. So what the hell is the point? I mean, intrinsically, like, at a moral level, what is the point of relationships? Should they exist or should they not? If they should exist, and they should because they can, and the fact that they can, they represent a higher, like, platonic level of you know, interaction between people. You can have relationships between men, right? So the MGTOW thing, you just kind of go down this road of, like, well, you know, relationships are pointless, we should just try to improve ourselves. Yet, improve yourselves to do what exactly? I can understand MGTOW as a nihilistic release for people who can't seem to cope with procreation, or the standards of it as is, but it doesn't seem to be, like, fundamentally, I put it in the same camp as every other nihilistic philosophy on whatever topic. It doesn't seem to be a solution, because it's trying to go down the road of saying, no, this thing, I can't do this thing, so this thing doesn't have value, but these other things have value. But there's actually, these other things that you're trying to chase, they either lead to nothing or they lead to the same thing, right? So you can't just go down that road. That's the issue with MGTOW. And there's also this, like, very, like crude, almost, like, kind of toxic culture attached to it with like alpha Chad, I guess, the alpha male paradigm culture. What's associated with that? People worship alpha males, and alpha males, you know, I guess their attitude towards other males bothers me. They don't seem to be respectful of the fact that some men have genuine problems when it comes to sexuality. and they don't seem to respect that, or they put it all they put the entire burden on the shoulders of, you know, the beta males or the males who can't get laid, and say, well, it's up to you, you know, get better. And if you can't, tough luck, screw you, you're fucked, that's your problem. Those are the those are the loudest voices when it comes to any sexuality related problem, online at least. And as I said, I don't agree with any of them. And of course you have incels as well, and incels are just, I mean, they're like the MGTOWs in there's a resentment there. I suppose the incel paradigm is the one that I lean towards most myself, but so there's a resentment there, based on, I guess, personal experience, and the resentment turns into an ideology, and an ideology that's then leveraged and used as, well, as in a similar, leveraged and used in a similar way that resentment-based ideologies are used politically in other places, which is problematic, right? So when I say that I'm, like, progressive in the sense that I'm pro-regulation for the, like, sexuality market, what I really mean is the dynamics of value in the sexual marketplace are dynamics that I am critical of. I don't want to look at them and just be like, well, people value this, so who are we to tell them what they should value or what they should find attractive? Who are we to do that? Who are we? People should just find whatever they find attractive and do their own thing, yada, yada, yada. Or, you know, people should just be nice to each other and not crude and respect boundaries and yada, yada. You know, that. And to me, that is all basic, like, nonsense thinking. Like, that's not deep thinking. That's not real thinking. That's not any sort of analysis. That's just kind of, let's just take it as is, because the way it is benefits me, and it benefits me, so it seems to work. Well, here's the thing, is, like, it seems to work because the underlying, like, moral substrata of society is already designed to work. That doesn't mean it works in a way that's kind of optimized. So I think, what if the solution to any potential sexuality problem is in the dynamics of value, of the value forms of sexuality themselves? Where exactly does sexual value come from? What is sexual value? Like, we haven't answered that question. Not that I know of, at least, right? Where does sexual value come from? So, and when I say sexual value, I don't mean attractiveness necessarily. I've talked about attractiveness, I think, once before in a possible world, like, asexualism video or something. I don't mean where does attractiveness, because that one seems more arbitrary. I'm not totally sure what, like, at least intuitively, I don't have a good sense of why certain bodies are, like, attractive and certain bodies are not attractive. Evolutionary psych will just be like, well, it's because of these reasons. And I'm sure that's, like, it's not that simple for me. What evolutionary psych says doesn't seem to, like, correlate logically. So what type of bodies are attractive isn't even the point. I'm saying, like, even assuming that whatever bodies people find attractive are, like, 1-to-1, and that if you know, in that if there's a 10-point scale for men and women, and that whatever point of the scale you're on, you are attracted to people who are at the same, like, you how do I explain this? Let's say there's a 10-point scale for both men and women, and whatever point of the scale you're on, right, you are likely to end up with someone who's at that same point of the gender or sex that you're attracted to. That's the idea of the 10-point scale, right? With hypergamy, you're trying to end up with someone who's at your level or above. So ultimately, the idea with the market is that, like, the way it all ends up working out is you're trying to end up with someone who's at your level or above. You'll end up with someone who's literally at your level. And if you're someone who is at the very bottom, who's at the lowest possible level, you can't be helped outside of, like, some kind of external intervention to try and to try and help improve your looks, simply because if there's no one at your level that matches your visual, like, who matches your level at the scale. And of course a 10-point scale is kind of ridiculous anyway, but I'm using it as a basic analogy. I'm trying to say that attractiveness isn't the point. Attractiveness isn't the point, because even with attractiveness, even if we have these 10-point scales, and even if we are I still feel like there's an issue with the way that the outcome emerges in disproportionately to where people will be on the scale, right? Because there's behavioral components to this. It's not just based on physical attraction, you know. And then recently, you know, you hear certain things that, especially people on the conservative end of this, say, like Peterson, when he talks about how, like, half of your ancestors, you have half as many male ancestors as female ones, which is a scary idea. And how women are attracted to psychopaths and stuff like that, or psychopathic sort of behaviors, right? Or behaviors that are at least perceptually akin to what psychopaths have. This type of, you know, visual behavioral confidence and stuff like that. These are the things that I'm worried about, not so much physical attraction. Physical attraction is, at some level, like I said, just becomes a matter of, you need plastic surgery. Like you need some type of procedure to help you, because there's no other way. Like, you can't expect all bodies to be equally attractive. And any kind of sex positive notion that we can be some weird like Eden of orgies where everyone's just like equally attracted to everyone, that, like, I don't see that happening. Yeah, that doesn't seem to be the case. And this is where it comes to incels, because, like, people will tell incels, like, you guys, look, you're not that unattractive. That's not your problem. Your problem is attitudinal. Your problem is your attitude, right? But the thing is, if evolutionary psych is correct, then the incels are doomed. There's no helping the incels, because it has nothing to do with... It has nothing to do... Like, it doesn't even matter what it has to do with. The fact of the matter is, men will simply procreate less than women. They will simply procreate less than women. And because they'll procreate less, you will have... You're going to get incels. Like, just the math doesn't work out any other way. It doesn't matter what the fucking reason is. If you have, you know, a million men and a million women, but the math just says historically that, you know, men are less likely to procreate, you have this dynamic where men are less likely to procreate. I don't see how you can look at that statistical outcome and just be like, lol, well, the men should try harder. Well, what do you mean they should try harder? Clearly trying harder doesn't fucking do anything when the outcome is the same each and every time, right? When no matter what, you still have this, like, huge chunk of where the hierarchy is still so severe in terms of procreation for men, right? So it doesn't seem to make sense to chalk it up to behavior. That's where I find it so, you know, that's where those types of solutions seem to be so trite. And evolutionary psych, like with evolutionary psych, you get the type of social Darwinism with it that's just like, and the social Darwinist will believe things that simply, well, you know, that's just what evolution ordains, that's what's best for the species, therefore. But that doesn't work either. And I think I've made arguments against social Darwinism before. They're the obvious ones because they're correct, which is that evolution picks the best traits and processes that it can. That doesn't mean it has picked the best things that it could have. It also doesn't mean it's picked the best things. As it stands, if the system works in this way, where there's this just vast chunk of men who are sexually doomed, that seems like a problem to me. Just politically, morally, that seems like a problem. How do you address that? How do you fix that? I'm hoping that maybe I just have the evidence wrong on this and that it's actually not that big of a category, but, you know, in which case the problem becomes something else. Then the problem does become about attractiveness and what your options are depending on where you are on the scale. But if it isn't about attractiveness, if it is literally about the statistical outcome, then we need a way of analyzing that. And my way of analyzing that is simply, at a basic level, I think it has to do with not with anything that's evolutionary psych, and not to do with any type of social conditioning. It simply has to do with the physical mechanics of our procreative process in the first place, right? So, I mean, it comes down to what the value form itself is for sexuality between men and women. What is that value form, and what does that value form look like? I think the value form, like, let's assume for a second that the value form for sexuality has to do with your ability, the individual's ability to contribute to procreation. So the individual person's, man or woman's ability to contribute to the procreation and proliferation of the species. Their capacity to do that. Their inherent capacity to do that, right? Not the traits that they have, not their attractiveness or their looks, not, anything behavioral, just their inherent capacity to contribute. And the reason I want to get to this level, because just to explain, it's like you need to have a way of, like, reducing men and women to these kinds of just things, that these kinds of neutral, objective methods, because only then can you achieve some type of, like, experiential symmetry between them. If there's no experiential symmetry between men and women, you can't ever compare men's problems to women's problems in society. You can't ever compare and see who has it worse, men or women, and whether it's a matriarchy or a patriarchy. You need a way to take the experience of being a man and the experience of being a woman and, like, reduce it to something, to some individual unit that you can say is identical for both. That's what I'm trying to do here, and I think you do get that when it comes to something like procreation. If you think of men and women in terms of their capacity to contribute to procreation, they're obviously different, right? Women are naturally, so two things with them. Women are naturally restricted when it comes to what they can do in life when they procreate. But procreation itself, inherently depends on them, right? It can't happen without them, and it's not even that it can't happen without them. It can't happen with either men or women, but the process necessarily has to go through, women. So their natural biology acts as sort of the gatekeeper to how the process works, right? A man can get any number of women pregnant at a time, but a woman can carry one child from one man every 9 months throughout her, like, fertile lifespan. That is the inherent biological restriction on a woman's ability to procreate, and it's also the system's inherent restriction on the system's ability to procreate, right? Women, the system as a whole, like humanity itself, depends on that, on those 9 months being optimal for carrying children, and that determines the number of children that you can have. That determines the system's ability to proliferate itself right there. And what I'm driving at is that the system's ability to proliferate itself is the source of the value in this case. It's one of the elements of the value form for sexual value, right? Not so much evolutionary psych and attractiveness, and this is why I'm trying to abstract from those things, because assuming those things can be relatively arbitrary. I'm not convinced that attractiveness is arbitrary, but let's just assume. Procreation and proliferation, these things clearly are not arbitrary. They clearly have to do with, like, physical structures of human, sexual organs and stuff. They're not... There's no way you can debate what they are. There's nothing cultural to them. Culture can emerge as a result of them, but they don't. We don't argue or debate, how many children a woman can have at a time. You can only have so many, on average, more or less. You can only have so many, throughout your life. And what does that do? It means that the system's inherent ability to exist depends on this process for women, which is heavily restricting for women, right? Heavily restricting for them experientially. Once they're, pregnant, They have to sit there and be pregnant for 9 months, and then they have to take care of the kid. But excluding that shit and all the stuff that comes afterwards, just sitting there for 9 months is already a huge fucking, like, tax. It's already a huge imposition on your individual experience. You don't get to do other things, or if you do other things, those 9 months are still, like, you're doing them with a child in your gut, in your belly. So it's pretty, like, it's very different. It's very different than just doing them how you would do them normally. That's a huge tax, right? Men don't have that problem. Men don't have the individual tax of having to carry children for 9 months. They don't have that. Instead, their contribution to procreation is far more basic. They just need to inject some sperm and then do whatever they want. Not whatever they want, obviously. There's a whole, like, social structure, but you know what I mean. Like, in theory, they can just do what they want. After you've injected sperm, you can run off and do it again, and do it, you know, in a million other places with a million other people. It doesn't fucking matter to the system, right? At a basic level, the system doesn't give a shit what the man does after he's injected sperm, insofar as the system cares about procreation only, right? If the system only cares about procreation, then, you know, all that it needs from the man is to inject some sperm. Again, and this is why I'm saying this is a huge assumption, because I'm assuming all the other shit that people have to do to raise children out of the equation. I'm just looking at the basic biology itself, because I want to limit it to just that. And I'm assuming that that's where the value comes from, right? And that's not even that insane of an assumption, considering that the actual physical mechanics of raising children probably has gotten easier over time with like automation and stuff like that. You know, making life generally more more convenient for people, stuff like that. Anyway, so yeah, biologically, women contribute more to procreation than men. Biologically, right? They contribute more to procreation than men. They contribute more time, they contribute more effort, they take on a higher burden, they take on a greater imposition. And because of that, their sexual value is always higher. That's the idea. That's the idea. Value simply comes from the fact that the system needs procreators, right? The system needs procreators, and procreators exist, and they select for one another, sexually select for one another based on one's ability to contribute to that, which is why women naturally have to give more. Not because they want to, necessarily. They have to. That's simply how they're built. They're designed that way. They have to give more. And because they have to give more, because the inherent structure of the system depends on it, they also get more, right? They have more sexual value coming in. You know, if the system, you know, if the system, I mean, just think about it like this. If the system has a certain number of men and women, my nose is itchy. If the system has a certain number of men and women, and let's say you kill 90% of the women, that's a huge tax on the system's population, because you are now restricted to just the 10% of women being able to shit out babies. Like, you're screwed at that point. You're screwed. I mean, you're not screwed, but you have a huge problem. Whereas you do the same thing with men. You'd have a huge problem based on all the other non-procreative things men do. But in terms of just procreation, you'd be totally fine. Like 10% of men could easily impregnate like the 100% of women. At the very least, it's going to be a lot easier for the 10% of men to fulfill their procreative duty to fulfill some, you know, optimal standard of procreative potential than it is for 10% of women, right? For the system to be satisfied. And that's why I'm trying to say that the system seems to decide where people's sexual value comes from, and just from the fact that men and women have, you know, this inherent biology built into them. So that's why it seems like the game is just stacked up against men, the sexual game itself. That's why men have to compete so, you know, with one another like crazy. That's why they have to try so hard to seem like the, you know, the biggest alpha on the block, because each individual man's sexual value is so low. That's why they're more expendable. You can get rid of most of them, right? Right. That's why men have to try so hard. And obviously, when the system is so hyper-competitive and hyper-competitive on a perceptional level, because it's not like most of those men don't actually have the ability to contribute to procreation. It's a perceptional thing. That's where the inequality comes from. And yes, I do realize going into all of this, saying this like that, this is a very like male-centric perspective, because I am thinking of this as a male problem. If you think that this isn't just a male problem, this is a female problem, or that there's some sort of symmetry, by all means, I'm aware of those arguments. At least I'm willing to entertain them, but I'm looking at it as a male problem because, well, at the very least, some element of it is a male problem. Like, there's definitely a problem here that exists for men alone. And to me, it just comes from the very nature of procreation itself. Men have less value to procreation than women because they're men. Because, physically speaking, there's not as much that they do to contribute to it. There's not as much that they do to contribute to it, so the system doesn't care about them as much. And it's not because in some type of, in theory, in biological theory, they couldn't. It's because the inherent biology of our species is designed in a way that it doesn't, right? You could have a species of a two-gender species, alphas and betas, right? You could have a two-sex species where both men and women each have to spend 9 months, like, biologically doing something before a kid pops out. Like, each of them are sucked into that process. And then you wouldn't see what we're seeing in society today, where you have, like, ultra-competitive sexual marketplace for men. You would not see that. Well, at the very least, you are far less likely to see that. You're far more likely to see some kind of, like, even distribution of sexual interest across the board. Attractiveness would still play a role, but you see my point, right? Like, imagine that for a man, you also had to spend 9 months. Or for, it was that difficult for you, right? That's where the lack of sexual value comes from. So how do you fix the problem then? How do you fix the problem? Well, see, here's the thing. This is where it becomes tricky because men are more expendable thanks to procreation, they then have to prove their value in other ways. And of course, we are operating under the assumption here that your value relative to procreation is not your true value. That's why it's a problem. Because if it wasn't, if your value as determined by the system's ability to procreate was your true value, there wouldn't be a problem here. Right? There wouldn't be any problem with some men being expendable. But it is a problem. It feels like a problem. And the only way it can be a problem is if that's not the full depiction of an individual person's value. Which means... and why is that the case? And the reason that's the case, well, I think value ultimately comes from complexity. Complexity in the system. The reason that's ultimately not the case is because... Well, this is my general criticism of social Darwinism, like I said before. It's because in order for things to work evolutionarily, not every form of value needs to be respected. Only some of them do. The rest of them can be kind of like, forgotten, or at the very least, relatively neglected. And that's where that turns into a problem. And when you see like 30% of men or something in their 20s, like, aren't procreating, or aren't getting laid, that's when you start seeing, like, holy shit, imagine 30%, imagine 15% of people were unemployed. We'd be having a crisis. Nobody would look at that and be like, that's just sexuality. That's just how it works. It's like, no, that's not just sexuality. That's human life right there being neglected. Because what the fuck, I'm not saying that there's nothing to do in life if you don't procreate, but it's like that old, it's like that old scene in Fiddler on the Roof where the girl is singing about, matchmaker, matchmaker, bring me a match. And she's like, she says something along the lines of, I'll promise you'll be happy, and even if you're not, there's more to life than that, don't ask me what. That's the line in the song. Meaning, I'm sure there's other things that a person can live a fulfilling life without having any kind of sexual relationship or intimate relationship or relationship, any type of like romantic relationship. I'm sure it's possible, but you cannot, politically, ethically, and politically, you can't rely on that as a baseline. You can't just say, well, the incels should just do something else. They should just go, like, fix their problem they should just go, like, play video games or something. It's like, what do you expect them to do, right? This is where certain things, it's like, well, what do you expect will happen? The suicide rate will go up. People will commit suicide. Not that there's no possible way for anyone in that circumstance to find fulfillment, but it's not likely going to happen because there's a systemic restriction. In the same way that you could say a homeless person could still live a fulfilling life. They can. But are all homeless people doing that? A poor person, a person... It's just kind of like you can't use the statistical extreme as the argument. Someone can go without food for 382 days. That doesn't mean that it's appropriate to say that, well, it's okay that the system has, there's 15% of people that have no food. And this is how I think about this, right? This is why I think about this as this kind of like systemic thing. You have a problem in the system if men aren't getting laid. Like, as simple as it goes. You have a problem in the system. Right? Even though biology itself seems to not give as much of a shit if they don't. But this is where biology is wrong, because biology doesn't account for all value forms. It just accounts for one's value form relative to the structure of human reproduction itself, which is a very specific structure. And it's especially visible in the world now when you see that, like, thanks to contraception and sexual liberation, women are relatively, like, separate. There's more of a gap between reproduction and sexual interest than there was before, right? That was one of the things that women were taxed by, is that they were stuck to that. Because of their inherent value towards procreation, they were attached, they were glued to that value, and they were glued to the responsibility that came with it, right? So if you ever had sex, you had to raise a kid prior to contraception, or at the very least you'd likely have to go through the whole 9-month period, which is a huge burden, right? And part of what liberated women was the introduction of contraception. It liberated them because it allowed them to separate their sexual interests from their procreative interests. And if you think about it logically, I don't know. Hey, I don't know anything about women, but do women honestly think when they're picking a mate, or when they're attracted to a guy, are they thinking about that man's potential in procreation, logically speaking? No, they're not. Of course they're not. And they're not because they don't have to. Those concepts come into play later on when, the relationship blossoms and stuff. They have no basis during the sexual selection part itself. And the sexual selection part itself, the sexual marketplace itself, that has way more to do with, like I said, perception, social capital, cultural perception of value, more so than your ability to procreate. Most men on the planet have as much, again, if you want to say they have as much potential to procreate as all the other men, right? They have as much ability to procreate as the alphas. So it seems ridiculous that we should encourage a system where, or at the very, it encourage is the wrong word, because it's not like anyone's encouraging it. It seems ridiculous that the system relies upon like an ultra inegalitarian division between men, when it's not like the men that don't procreate have no value whatsoever. It's not like they have nothing to offer to the system, right? And that's the whole argument about how to improve them as well, is it's just like, hey, if you can't get laid, just go do something else, go try to self-actualize in some other way, try to perfect yourself. It's like, well, yeah, but if you can do that, then you have value to the system, so there's no reason why you shouldn't procreate either. And you see where I'm going with this. If the more we separate sexual, like, what's attractive from one's ability to procreate, there's no reason why everyone shouldn't procreate. And if everyone shouldn't procreate, the fact that procreation is attached to sexual selection is where the whole problem started from. Which is why the solution to all this is what I think, and a lot of people probably could see the same thing, it's artificial wombs. Artificial wombs. Artificially, like, incubate and raise children using just raw genetic material. And artificial wombs that you can use as a man without needing to go through a woman. That's specifically what I'm talking about. That's what you need. That's what you need to solve the incel problem. Because once you have artificial wombs, this seems like a weird answer, but trust me, there's a logic to this, which is that once you have artificial wombs, you can draw the distance between reproduction and sexuality even further, right? You can sever the tie altogether. Now, that might freak out some conservative people, and trust me when I say this, I'm not about severing it for all people. I'm just saying for the system as a whole, you don't need people to rely on, some kind of archetypal romantic relationship to be able to procreate. The system's ability to procreate won't depend on men being able to prove themselves to women, or men being able to have sort of, economic value or something that has nothing to do with their procreative potential, right? Your ability to procreate is literally up to you at that point, insofar as you have the ability and the means and the resources to procure an artificial womb and to raise the kid afterwards. That's a whole nother story, but you get what I'm saying. With artificial wombs, men won't need women to procreate. And some people might already get freaked out at this. Trust me when I say this. I'm not saying that everyone should have an artificial womb. I'm not saying that artificial wombs should replace women. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that. Trust me when I say I'm not saying that. I don't want anything to replace women. What I'm saying is that artificial wombs will end up taking the burden. This actually benefits women as well, but they'll take the burden of the system's procreative functionality on them, right? This benefits women because women won't be burdened by the process themselves, right? This benefits men because they won't need to prove themselves to women as a result. The point I'm trying to make is that all the evaluative, like, gears that account for people's sexual decisions now, that depend on the biological constraints themselves, will go away once you have artificial wombs, right? A man will be able to procreate simply by owning an artificial womb, right? And I'm presuming, you have an artificial womb and the ability to get genetic material from someone as well, right? Donating eggs or something, or maybe there's synthetic eggs. I don't know. That part is tricky, but you at the very least don't need to have you don't need to go through sex to get to have a child. And then people will say, well, hold on, men don't care about having kids. That's a whole, like, supply demand thing, though. They don't care about it because women care about it, not because they don't care about it because they have to go through women, not because they don't have the capacity to care about it. I'm sure men have the capacity to care about having kids just as much as women if they had the ability to do so. They just don't have the ability to do so. With artificial wombs, they would. This would also make things a lot easier for women who don't want to have to rely on their sexual value, to have personal value, right? Because otherwise, for women, like I said, their personal value, their value to the system comes from their sexual value. If they don't want to rely on that and they don't want to be burdened by that, they get to be liberated by that through the use of artificial wombs, because people will just use artificial wombs to procreate. And women won't have to care as much about being pregnant and worrying about that. Again, I'm trying to stress I'm trying to stress that all of this should be optional. None of this should be forced onto people. None of this should be like, none of these things should be assumed to be cultural standards that should just replace all existing biological reproduction or family or anything like that. This is just one of the tools that you need, I think, to improve the dynamics of the system as is. And I do think it ultimately helps, you know, fix the incel problem. Yeah, because because the idea of it now, because the narrative that I'm trying to draw here, right, is that our impression of what's attractive for men and women, our impression of what's like sexually interesting between men and women, goes back, you know, maybe by evolutionary psych. It's very deep embedded in the brain. It's cultural. Part of it exists, like, according to me, according to this theory that I'm trying to present here, according to me, part of it exists simply due to people's perception of your ability to help the system proliferate. That's the actual, like, logical, that's the like, what I'm saying is that component, that's the underlying component that determines the value. That component culturally vanishes once you introduce something like artificial wombs. Your ability to proliferate is still there, but it's not, the relative difference between men and women goes away. That's what's not there, right? As a man, your ability to procreate, you know, it's not defined by the fact that you can only inject sperm. If you want to have more value and more responsibility, you can, because you have an artificial womb now, right? And if for a woman, if you don't want to have the responsibility and you don't want to have the value, you can just not do anything, right? Or you also can just use an artificial womb now. The existence of artificial wombs allows that whole value form to go away, which means men and women can now self-actualize, but rather sexual value for men and women now cannot depend on that. Now, it cannot depend on that because it'll have to depend on anything else that is like perceptionally or visibly attractive about those people. But it can't be that. Because the idea, what I'm trying to say here is, whether it's genetic or psychological or cultural or whatever it is in people's brains that makes, you know, incels exist, it comes from the fact that people assume you're a loser. You know, that's what it comes down to. People think you're a loser, and no one wants to date a loser, and no one wants to procreate with a loser. But why do you think this person's a loser? Well, you think they're a loser because of reasons A, B, and C. And those reasons have to do with their ability to procreate, their ability to contribute to the system. It's perceptional, but it's a perception that matters, because perception is, that's a whole complicated thing, but it's a perception that matters. And so if you have artificial wombs change the system, it's a perception that won't matter anymore. No one will care about it. No one will care about, like, you won't be a loser because you don't have the ability to contribute to the system in this way. You won't have to prove yourself performatively as a male, you know, in order to procreate, because you don't need that, because you have an artificial womb. No one will care about it. What I'm trying to say is culture itself will readjust around this mechanic, because it'll then be the new mechanic by which the system itself proliferates. That's what I'm trying to say. So things that seem very unattractive now, which we can argue is where incels come from, right? It's not that incels inherently are unattractive. It's that they seem very unattractive to, you know, women. You know, it's that incels seem very unattractive, so that no one wants anything to do with them, so they don't get laid and nothing happens. And they have this attitude, right? They won't seem as unattractive. Whatever they did wrong that made them seem unattractive won't be there anymore. They won't seem as unattractive. You know, it's like the two rules. It's like you have to be attractive and don't be unattractive. Well, whatever people are doing that's making them seem unattractive, I claim, this theory at least claims, comes from some implicit assumption people have about your ability to contribute to the system's proliferation. But that implicit assumption will vanish once artificial wombs are on the table. And I can already foresee some kind of weird social Darwinist argument about saying how like, no, those men should not procreate simply because they were not selected. That's a stupid fucking argument. I'm sorry, but that's a stupid argument because it goes back to, again, my general criticism of social Darwinism. People's value is not entirely defined by what evolution has put on the table because it has not accounted for everything. That's the issue. It has not accounted for everything. There's things it's accounted for that we logically aren't accounting for, sure, but it doesn't account for everything, and that's why it doesn't seem unfair to say that, like, if you're an incel right now, you could go procreate, you know, with an artificial womb and have a family, literally have a family that way. You know, take on the responsibility, have a family, and no one will care. And there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to do that. And there's no reason that that would be like an incorrect choice or that would be problematic for society in any way. I mean, like we're saying, like, again, it comes down to what we think real value is, right? If your ability to have the outcome of, you know, dating someone and being sexually fulfilled proves that you have value, I mean, I suppose it's one of the things that proves it, but if that's the thing that proves that you have value, that's what makes you attractive, then you have to go through that. Otherwise, you don't deserve to procreate, or you don't deserve to live a fulfilling life according to you. It's like, well, what if there's other ways to prove it? You know, what if there's other ways to prove it, but these are things that are might still seem unattractive to women, or maybe the problem can be reversed as well, and some things seem weirdly unattractive to men. It's like, well, now you don't have to prove it this way. Now you don't have to prove it this way. Now you can prove it in other ways. So I'm not convinced that that having, like, dating and having a relationship is not proof that you have inherent value, right? There's other ways of proving that you have inherent value, and if you can do it, again, and when I say prove it, I mean prove it philosophically. I don't mean prove it like you don't have to prove it to the government or something. But I'm saying there's other ways to prove it. And if you can prove it, well then, ethically speaking, why not procreate? There's no reason to say these people shouldn't procreate if they have the value. Now, obviously, if you're a mess of a man and you're just like eating Cheetos, you know, you're sitting on your couch and you're just fucking irresponsible and you're a mess and you suck at everything, well then yes, then you probably shouldn't procreate, artificial womb or not. What I'm talking about is like someone who has their shit together but for some reason can't get laid. That's what I'm talking about. Those types of people, you know, that component of the incel problem gets solved. That's what I'm trying to say here. Yeah, but I'm already saying this, like, because a lot of this has to do with criticisms of social Darwinism, because I can already see the social Darwinist argument coming a mile away before artificial wombs are even on the table. As soon as artificial wombs are on the table, they're going to start crying how, no, that will be irresponsible breeding, because after all, you know, all existing forms of breeding are responsible. Because all existing forms where people, you know, where like... accidental pregnancies where men and women hook up are responsible forms of breeding as is, because that's just evolution or some bullshit, right? Or, you know, men, you know, women having sort of sexual standards where they choose, you know, like the argument is like women are attracted to assholes and then the assholes end up breeding. That's a responsible form of breeding. I'm sorry, I don't see it that way. That doesn't seem like a responsible form of breeding to me. Also, oh god, I realize I'm talking about breeding in a very kind of like inhumane way, but that's just to make it easy to talk about it. Because I, like, analytically, there's no like easy humane way to talk about this that's not just kind of cold. It's cold because we're talking about procreation. Like, there's just inhumane breeding. Yes, I know. It's a cold thing when I'm describing it as is. And if there's no way to solve this problem, well then, you know, then you have to go down the road of accepting some very, like, pessimistic conclusions about the nature of our species. Because otherwise what we're saying is that we're encouraging a society that is, like, you know, deeply alienating for a good chunk of people that end up existing. Even if it's not like that large a chunk of people, it's more people than I'm happy with. And this is like independent of my own personal. I'm saying these concerns are independent of my own personal value in this regard. Like, my own personal value aside, this is still a problem in my head. I don't want, you know, I don't want there to be an incel problem in society. It seems it seems cruel. Anyway, happy 2019. That's virtually everything I had to say on this topic for now. This is definitely a topic that will come up again and again and again as I sort of get more information, and I know that, like, the evidence, all of the evidence for all the different, like, layers of the problem, nature, nurture, you know, sexuality in humans versus sexuality in other animals, and et cetera, et cetera. All of that shit is very complicated. I'm aware that it's complicated. I know that this isn't, like, easy. I'm just saying, I'm just throwing out, to understand how my fucking channel works, I'm throwing out these theories to give people another lens of, to, at the very least, to provide, like, this is a lens of how you can think about this and describe certain outcomes that we see in the world. Like, I find the idea that value, not even genetic value, but like both nature and nurture actually emerge because of the system, like the dynamics of nature and nurture actually emerge because of the system's inherent, because of the inherent value form of procreation itself and the biological structure of it. I find that to be a very interesting idea, and I think it explains a lot of these types of perceptions where, you know, men seem to be very, like, expendable when it comes to procreation compared to women. I think it's useful in that regard. Anyway, yeah, that's all I have to say. You know, good luck to anyone in 2020. I'm hoping to have a very productive year. I'm hoping to get a lot of things done and have lots of interesting things to talk about. Trying to end this motherfucker on a positive note, but yeah, that's basically it. You know, cheers and farewell till next time.